Today's video is going to be on Norman Bethune. Norman Bethune is probably one of the most famous Canadians ever abroad in general, but he's very famous in China, really for being a humanist, for what he brought to that country and for helping people and bringing medical care to the people that needed it. He had a pretty interesting life, and this video is going to serve as a brief overview of his life and his impact, sort of a reflection of his legacy that he has in Canada. Let's go. So Norman Bethune was born in 1890 in the town of Gravenhurst, which is in Ontario. He eventually made his way to the University of Toronto to start his medical degree. But like many people, when World War I started, he enlisted in the Canadian Armed Forces, and he went in Europe to fight for Canada or for Britain at the time. After the war ended, he eventually came back to Canada. He continued his medical degree, and he worked around in Britain, in Canada, and the United States. And eventually in the 1920s, he got tuberculosis, and that made him think about how the different ways that tuberculosis could be treated. And at the time, it was only bed rest, basically, that they prescribed to you. That pushed him to go to Montreal and study at McGill University, where he became sort of a specialist and expert in thoracic surgery. He actually was one of the people that found a new way to treat tuberculosis, and he made major innovations when it came to the treatment of tuberculosis. That was around the late 1920s, and as many people know, before World War II, there was a Great Depression. Norman Bethune was one of the people that saw the sort of social, economic impacts of that depression and the inequalities when it came to access to medical care. During that time, he would even go on in the streets of Montreal and offer free medical care to people that needed it. By not only being a doctor but also a surgeon, he was still able to make a living during that time, but around him he saw many people that were suffering and that needed access to medical care but that weren't able to get it, because at the time we didn't have our universal health care system, right? And he was one of the first ever people in Canada to call for universal health care. So he eventually became part of the Communist Party of Canada, and you have to contextualize that in the time of fascism, capitalism, communism, all these ideologies competing against one another. Obviously, Canada was more on the capitalism side. So him being part of the Communist Party did not help his image, and that's why he sort of became ostracized in Canada. So in 1936, he decided to go to Spain and participate in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans. And the Republicans at the time consisted of socialists, communists, and there were the nationalists who they were fighting against, who were headed by the General Francisco Franco, who ruled Spain afterwards. They eventually won that war. That's besides the point. During his time in the Spanish Civil War, he was a pioneer of the mobile blood transfusion system. He established a Canadian Institute in Madrid, and he would get donations, blood donations from people that were in Madrid or coming from abroad, and he would bring that blood to wounded soldiers literally on the battlefield. And he established a Canadian Institute. In Spanish, it's called the Servicio Canadiense de Transfusión de Sangre. Through that institute, he was able to do some mobile blood transfusions to a lot of wounded soldiers. In 1937, he came back to Canada, and during that time, he was considered a propagandist. He went on numerous speaking tours around not only Canada, but even the United States, and collected a lot of money to keep the funding going for that mobile blood transfusion institute that he had started. It was finally in 1938 that Bethune decided to go to China to fight alongside the Chinese forces that were fighting a war against the Japanese. He joined the Chinese communists, right, that were led by Mao Zedong. And again, he would be literally on the front lines performing either operations on wounded soldiers, doing blood transfusions. So you can imagine at the time, not only that China didn't have the medical sort of technology that the West had at the time, but they just weren't an industrialized nation. Bethune brought a whole wealth of knowledge when it came to modern medicine and even new tools and the drugs that were needed to help support the communist forces at the time. So not only did he train Chinese doctors, he also set up a whole bunch of mobile medical units, because one of the things that would happen is that they would build a hospital, but it would get automatically destroyed, because think about it, the Japanese weren't industrialized nations and they had things like planes that they could use and they could bomb countries. That's why having a mobile unit was a lot more efficient. He would take all these volunteers, all these soldiers that came to fight, and he would write their blood type, organize it all together, and he would have have a blood bank that was filled with different blood types, and anytime a soldier needed more blood, they could automatically bring it and use that mobile blood transfusion system that he had pioneered back in Spain. And the Chinese people that Bethune worked with, they not only saw him as a great doctor, obviously, but also someone that embodied the sort of spirit of communism in a way. He had sacrificed his more comfortable life back in Canada, and he was completely dedicated to the work he was doing for communism. So he embodied that spirit of fighting for the ideology. During his time in China, he even personally met Mao Zedong. That's part of the reason why Mao Zedong kept Norman Bethune's legacy alive in China, is because he had personally met him. Finally, it was in 1939, Bethune passed away. He got sepsis, and sepsis is basically just a blood infection. He was performing a medical procedure in the middle of the battlefield, and he wasn't wearing any protective equipment, and he had a cut on his hand, got infected, so he got sepsis and he passed away. And Mao Zedong, the leader of the Communist Party in China, he published a eulogy about Norman Bethune, honoring his devotion and the self-sacrifice again that he had made, and just his devotion in general to the communist cause. So among many things, that eulogy says, we must all learn from the spirit of absolute selflessness from him. With this spirit, everyone can be useful to the people. A man's ability may be great or small, but if he has this spirit, he is already noble-minded and pure, a man of moral integrity and above vulgar interests, a man who is of value to the people. Bethune got buried in China, so that's his resting place today, and he's got many statues that are devoted to him in China still today, and children are still reading this eulogy that Mao Zedong wrote about him in their elementary books, and he's by far the most famous Canadian in China today. Bethune is honored in a certain way in Canada, so among many things, we can find a statue of him in Montreal, so we can find that here. And in his hometown of Gravenhurst, Ontario, the house that he grew up in was converted into a museum. When Canada established diplomatic relationships with China in the 1970s, that meant that a lot of Chinese people wanted to come to Canada specifically to see where one of their national, well, not technically national heroes, but one of their heroes grew up. They converted his house into a museum, and today it's a National Historic Site, and around 12,000 people visit it every year. Of those 12,000 people, 75% of them are actually Chinese. So you have all these Chinese people that are coming to Canada and going to Gravenhurst, Ontario, out of all places, to visit Norman Bethune's house where he grew up. So that just reflects the impact that he had in China at the time and the legacy that's left. He arguably has a bigger legacy over there than here, and the fact that he's buried in China exemplifies that too in a way. Now we recognize the medical innovations that he made in Canada, and we have statues honoring him and the museum. Him being a proponent of universal health care is interesting to juxtapose that today, because we have universal free health care. He was a proponent of that way before, and he was offering people free medical care during the Great Depression, one of the darkest times in Canadian history. But all in all, Norman Bethune is one of the most famous Canadians abroad in general, but he's particularly famous and revered in China today. Not because he's a celebrity or a TikToker or a musician or an actor, whatever. You know, it's because he legitimately brought good to those people and brought new technology that help them fight for their cause. Whatever we think and where we align politically, it's just very cool to see how a Canadian is revered in such a way, because objectively he did bring good, and he was a humanist. He wanted to help as many people as he could, and it's a great Canadian story, you know, but it's just too bad that in Canada his story isn't as famous as it is in China. Guys, if you liked the video, click the like button. You can also find me on Instagram, where you're gonna find more content. I'm also on Spotify, where you can listen to some of my music. So if you like Canadian content, videos on general history, and some good music, then stick around. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you at the next one.